If you are watching energy futures markets right now in Houston, Calgary, and London, you are seeing a number that has not moved this violently since the Arab oil embargo of 1973. West Texas Intermediate crude spiked sharply within minutes of a single government statement released from Ottawa. Natural gas futures in the Northeast corridor surged. And the Canadian dollar, the currency Trump's trade team predicted would crater under pressure, strengthened against the US dollar. Every commodities trader on the planet is reading the same signal simultaneously. Mark Carney controls critical infrastructure that the American economy cannot function without, and Donald Trump just dared him to redirect it. An $865 billion energy partnership, the kind of deal that locks in 340,000 jobs and North American energy independence for a generation, is now dead. And the consequences are already moving through futures contracts, utility company spreadsheets, and the phone lines of Republican senators in every cold-weather state in the country. The question that every energy consumer in New England, every auto worker in the Midwest, and every investor with North American infrastructure exposure needs answered right now is this: did Washington just hand China and Europe the most valuable economic gift of the century, and does anyone in the administration understand what they gave away? To reconstruct what happened, we need the documented factual record and the energy dependency data that gives it meaning. The meeting was framed publicly as the formalization of a memorandum of understanding on energy infrastructure investment, new pipeline capacity, upgraded refinery connectivity, joint liquefied natural gas terminals, and renewable energy grid partnerships spanning both countries. According to reporting in Carney's subsequent public statement, Trump arrived with a completely rewritten document that had not been part of the 6 weeks of prior negotiation. The document reportedly contained 3 conditions that fundamentally restructured the nature of the proposed agreement: a fixed discounted rate for Canadian energy exports to the United States, a requirement that Canadian energy sales to European or Asian markets receive U.S. Department of Energy approval, and an emergency override provision granting the United States authority over pipeline and transmission infrastructure on American soil during declared energy emergencies. Carney's office subsequently released a statement confirming the talks had collapsed, announcing the suspension of all new energy infrastructure projects designed for U.S. export, and stating that Canada would prioritize energy partnerships with the European Union and Asian markets going forward. That statement landed on markets that already understood something the administration appears not to have fully calculated. Canada's energy leverage position has structurally changed over the past 18 months in ways that make a walkout economically viable in a manner it would not have been in 2020. The structural transformation of Canada's energy export architecture is the essential context without which this confrontation cannot be properly understood. For most of the post-war period, Canada exported the overwhelming majority of its oil and natural gas southward into the American market, creating the kind of single customer dependency that translated into negotiating weakness. That architecture is in the process of active, documented reversal. LNG Canada, the $40 billion liquefied natural gas terminal project in British Columbia with PetroChina holding a 15% ownership stake, shipped its first cargo to Asia in July 2025, a milestone British Columbia Premier David Eby described as proof that it's more important than ever that we get our resources to global markets and reduce our reliance on the United States. In August 2025, Prime Minister Carney traveled to Berlin and signed a joint declaration of intent with Germany on energy and critical mineral cooperation, with Canada's energy minister stating that LNG shipments to Germany could begin in as little as 5 years. At Davos in January 2026, Carney delivered a speech, which Fortune described as confirmation that he really is planning a Canada split with the US, in which he announced 12 new trade deals and declared that the 80-year period of American global economic leadership was over. This is not diplomatic positioning. This is infrastructure being built, contracts being signed, and shipping lanes being established. Once a $40 billion LNG terminal is operational and pointing west toward Asia and east toward Europe, it does not reorient southward because a new administration in Washington asks nicely. Infrastructure is destiny. The pipelines that exist determine the flows that follow. The multidimensional analysis of this energy confrontation operates across 5 planes that interact with compounding force. On the legal and regulatory dimension, Trump's proposed emergency override authority on Canadian pipeline infrastructure raises a sovereignty question that has no precedent in the bilateral relationship. The 1977 Pipeline Treaty between the United States and Canada establishes frameworks for cross-border energy infrastructure, but it contains no provision granting either country operational authority over the other's infrastructure during declared emergencies. Legal scholars at the Canadian Institute of Resources Law have noted that the proposed override mechanism would represent a fundamental departure from the treaty's reciprocal sovereignty framework. Canada's retaliatory toolkit, environmental review requirements for energy export infrastructure, export licensing revisions under the Export and Import Permits Act, and critical mineral export controls, is entirely within established Canadian statutory authority and requires no new legislation to deploy. The asymmetry is significant. Canada's legal options for applying pressure are administratively deployable within weeks, while any American attempt to compel Canadian energy supply would face immediate international legal challenge. On the political and power dynamics dimension, the political geography of this energy dispute maps directly onto the 2026 midterm electoral map in ways that Republican strategists understand with acute clarity. New England, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, depends on Canadian natural gas for the overwhelming majority of its winter heating supply. The senators representing those states, even Republican-adjacent ones, are already fielding constituent calls about heating costs. Energy company executives, utility CEOs, and state governors from cold-weather states represent a corporate and gubernatorial pressure coalition that is operationally more powerful than any trade advocacy group in Washington. Carney's strategic calculation, freeze expansion projects rather than cut existing supply, is precisely calibrated to activate that coalition against the administration's position. He is not cutting off supply. He is creating the credible threat of future supply insufficiency, which is sufficient to generate the political pressure he needs without triggering the international legal and diplomatic consequences of an actual supply interruption. On the economic and financial dimension, the arithmetic of American energy dependency on Canada is not ambiguous. Canada supplies approximately 61% of the crude oil entering the Great Lakes refining region and is the dominant supplier for refineries in Texas, Illinois, and Oklahoma through existing pipeline infrastructure operating near capacity. The U.S. Energy Information Administration projects American oil demand growth of approximately 7% over the next 5 years, growth that was factored into investment planning on the assumption of expanded Canadian pipeline capacity. If Canada redirects that planned capacity expansion toward Asian and European markets, American refineries compete for a shrinking relative supply against growing demand. Commodity pricing responds to supply-demand imbalance not linearly but exponentially at the margin, particularly in regional markets with limited import alternatives. Natural gas dependency in the Northeast is even more concentrated. The region's heating infrastructure was built on the assumption of reliable Canadian supply, and the expansion projects that were supposed to meet growing demand as homes convert from oil to gas heating have now been frozen. The $865 billion framework was not purely government money, it was a commitment structure that unlocked pension fund investment, sovereign wealth fund participation, and private equity deployment into infrastructure that is now being repriced for political risk. Oxford Energy Institute's February 2026 analysis of the global LNG market documents a structural oversupply developing in 2026 to 2027 as new export capacity comes online globally, meaning Canada has market timing on its side, Asian buyers need new supply sources, and Canada's LNG Canada terminal is operational and geographically advantaged. Shipping to South Korea takes 20 fewer days from British Columbia than from the U.S. Gulf Coast. On the public opinion and media dimension, Carney's communications architecture has been designed with unusual strategic coherence. His Davos speech, his Berlin energy diplomacy, and his public statements following the collapse talks constitute a consistent narrative directed simultaneously at domestic Canadian audiences, international investors, and, critically, American consumers in states where energy costs are politically salient. His remark to reporters that, "You can't tariff something you don't have access to," was not improvised. It is a precise encapsulation of his negotiating position designed to be clipped, shared, and covered. The framing inverts the traditional power dynamic of U.S.-Canada negotiations. Instead of Canada worrying about losing access to the American consumer market, the United States is now being asked to worry about losing access to Canadian supply. That inversion, once established in market psychology and media coverage, is difficult to reverse regardless of what happens in subsequent negotiations. On the international and comparative dimension, The geopolitical realignment dimension of this story is where the longest-term consequences reside. China, Germany, Japan, and South Korea have all been seeking to expand Canadian energy supply relationships for reasons entirely independent of the US-Canada dispute. Germany's desperation to replace Russian gas, Japan and South Korea's structural LNG demand growth, and China's strategic interest in Canadian commodity supply chains all predate the current confrontation. Carney's walkout did not create this demand. It converted latent interest into activated negotiating urgency. The European Commission's readiness to fast-track Canadian LNG import negotiations and Germany's Berlin invitation to Carney are documented responses to a market opening that the administration's conduct has accelerated. A diversion of even 30% of Canadian energy export capacity away from the American market is not reversible on a change of administration. Infrastructure investment at that scale requires 20-year amortization horizons that lock in trade flows regardless of political cycles in Washington. The stakeholder analysis in this energy dispute reveals a configuration in which the administration's leverage position is considerably weaker than its negotiating posture implied. Mark Carney enters this confrontation with structural advantages that are genuinely unusual for a Canadian Prime Minister in dealings with Washington. As the official who managed Canada through the 2008 financial crisis without a single bank failure and stabilized the Bank of England through the initial Brexit turbulence, he operates with a risk quantification framework that is explicitly non-political. His Davos declaration that he meant what he said about splitting from American trade dependency was not rhetorical. It was backed by the LNG Canada terminal already shipping to Asia, the Berlin Declaration already signed, and 12 new trade agreements already announced. His domestic political position reinforces this. The Liberal government's mandate was built partly on assertive economic nationalism, and the Canadian electorate is, according to polling cited by Business Insider, in a moment of heightened national identity around economic sovereignty. The American energy industry stakeholders, the refinery operators, pipeline companies, utility executives, and infrastructure investors who built their business models on stable Canadian supply, represent the most powerful domestic pressure on the administration to reverse course. Their financial exposure is direct and quantifiable, and their political access to Republican leadership is among the most effective in Washington. State governors from cold-weather states, facing constituent pressure on heating costs that will become visible before the November midterms, represent a second tier of Republican political pressure that operates independently of corporate lobbying. The affected American consumers, particularly the 10 to 15 million households in the Northeast whose heating infrastructure has no near-term alternative to Canadian natural gas, are the stakeholders with the least institutional agency and the most direct personal financial exposure to the consequences of this standoff. Looking ahead, the trajectory of the energy confrontation will be determined by a race between three variables: the pace at which energy cost effects become consumer visible in politically relevant states, the speed at which Canada's Asian and European infrastructure commitments pass the point of no return, and whether the administration's internal decision-making process is capable of the kind of rapid course correction that avoiding serious economic damage would require. The most likely near-term scenario, roughly 50% probable, is the corporate circuit breaker. Energy company executives, utility CEOs, and state governors generate sufficient concentrated pressure on Republican congressional leadership that the administration agrees to return to the original negotiated framework terms, allowing Trump to characterize the outcome as a win through selective emphasis on minor Canadian concessions. This outcome averts the immediate crisis but permanently reprices the risk premium on North American energy infrastructure investment. Every future deal in this sector will be written with political risk clauses that did not exist before this week. A second scenario, perhaps 30% probable, involves the administration responding to Carney's walkout with punitive tariffs on Canadian energy imports, framed under national security authority. Canada responds with the environmental review mechanism, creating the regulatory uncertainty that produces effective supply reduction without a legally actionable supply cut. Energy prices in northern states become a consumer crisis by late fall, arriving in exactly the pre-midterm window when incumbents are most vulnerable. The Federal Reserve faces the inflation-recession dilemma described earlier, with no clean policy response available. The third scenario, 20% probable but structurally irreversible, is the full diversification execution. Canada completes the infrastructure commitments already in progress with Europe and Asia at a pace that permanently reduces American market share of Canadian energy exports below 50%. The LNG Canada Phase 2 expansion, Cedar LNG, and the Churchill-Montreal Atlantic Export Corridor projects currently under discussion would, if completed, create export capacity that makes the American market optional rather than necessary for Canadian energy producers. That scenario does not require any dramatic political decision from Ottawa. It requires only that the projects already announced continue on their current timelines while Washington remains unable to offer a negotiating framework Canada finds acceptable. What this confrontation ultimately represents is the first serious empirical test of whether American energy leverage over Canada still operates in the same direction it has for the past 80 years. The answer emerging from futures markets, infrastructure investment decisions, and the diplomatic calendars of European and Asian energy ministers is that the leverage has quietly, structurally inverted, not completely, not irreversibly, but sufficiently that the assumption underlying the administration's negotiating posture is no longer sound. Mark Carney did not manufacture this leverage. He inherited it from a decade of Canadian infrastructure investment, LNG export terminal construction, and trade diversification diplomacy that predates his prime ministership. What he has done is recognize it, deploy it with precision, and communicate it to markets and governments in a way that makes the new reality legible to everyone simultaneously. The United States built its post-war economic order on the premise that American market access was the most valuable thing in the world and that no rational actor would voluntarily risk losing it. Canada, in July 2025, shipped its first LNG cargo to Asia. In August 2025, it signed an energy declaration with Germany. In January 2026, its prime minister told the world from Davos that the old order was over. And in February 2026, it walked out of a meeting and let the markets deliver the message that no press release could. Subscribe and hit the notification bell when the next move comes, and it will come within days. You need the structural context before the spin arrives. Tell us in the comments, which breaks first, corporate pressure forcing Washington back to the table, or Canadian infrastructure investment reaching the point of no return with Asian markets.